Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lawrence Bowdish. I am the Senior Director for Research here at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation, and I'd like to welcome you to our panel today. And by panel, I mean I'll be talking by myself on called 4% or 40%, some new data on business closure rates around the country, particularly as it has to do with small business closures after disasters and some insights we can gain on what we expect to see from COVID moving forward. A few notes before we begin. Unfortunately, I'm doing all of the background work and presentation work myself. So while I'll maintain eye contact with the camera as much as possible when you'll see my camera on film, I will have to look to the left to check for questions that are going to come through either through YouTube or the Hub platform. Happy to do both. So unfortunately, you will see me jog to the left to see those questions. In addition, I noted in the Hub chat that this is technically a work in progress. I have very thick skin, and more than happy to take any sort of comments, questions, guidance, thoughts on that score. This is going to be more of an informal setting as we can do it here. That said, I have decided to put behind me Harvard Business School, which I have zero affiliation with, but figure that might give me a little je ne sais quoi to maybe have everyone take us a little more impactfully. So with that, again, happy that everyone's here. Again, happy to take questions. Let's go and get started with some. Let's go ahead and get started with some work. So again, the name of this presentation is 4% or 40 business closure rates after disaster. That's my name. You can reach me on the Hub platform. My email is lbowdish@uschamber.com. However you want to reach me is fine. Just 1 second, I'm having trouble advancing. Oh, there we go. Apologies for that. So the reason I pursued this work was the numbers that we often see from SBA and other groups to say that 40% of small businesses close after disaster. And this is some of the work, this is some of the things you might see on disaster-based closures on small businesses. That immediately, 40% of small businesses won't reopen. 1 year later, 25% more small businesses will close. 3 years later, 75% of businesses without a continuity plan will fail. There's a question in the YouTube about M&As. I'll get to that at the end. Generally they don't, but they might. And I'll explain how that accounting works closer to the end of this presentation. That's a good question. Thank you. Now, if you look at what happened in Katrina, 2005 in New Orleans, there's an article down here at the bottom that I have referenced. So Sidner and others tracked 497 small businesses immediately after Katrina hit New Orleans. So if you would think Katrina is one of the most expensive, destructive hurricanes to hit, what you'd expect to see is 40% just won't reopen, 25% more close a year later, and 75% will close 3 years after that. Well, out of the 500, in 2013, 371 were still open with the same owner. That results in 75.6% of these companies survived over 8 years. Now, the thing to think about this is, of course, there might be some selection bias. Of course, there might be some industry-based work here, or maybe some of these were better suited than others to survive. Ones that are more likely to respond to a survey are the ones probably more likely to make it over 8 years. But still, it sort of gives flies in the face of this 40% number. Now, of course, as we've been hearing about for the past day and a half of this conference, we're living in another disastrous time around COVID. In addition to the social unrest with racial justice that is occurring across our country. And that 40% number comes up again. So here, and I'm taking a chart that my colleagues at the Chamber have put out very early in the COVID-19 response. This was, I think, the second week, very late in March. And here, people were relatively optimistic. Only 1% of businesses couldn't make it a couple of weeks. Another 19% had temporarily closed. 38% were partially open, and 41% were still fully open 2 weeks later. On the other side of this, we have this article that came out about 2.5 weeks ago. 41% of businesses have closed on Yelp, have closed, shut down for good during the coronavirus pandemic. So we see this 40% number come up again. Now, it's obviously a different situation. This is the economic impact, and combined with the impact of the virus, is causing a huge issue with companies. But I want to talk a little bit about what we can expect to see moving forward. So I want to start with impact on the business community. And some of you may have seen me present on this part of the presentation. It'll be a repeat for you, but I want to make sure everyone's on the same page when we talk about business community work. So what I have here is something from JP Morgan Chase Institute that tracked the impact of Harvey and Irma on small businesses on their cash inflows. And as you see here, blue is Harvey and the orange is Irma. And you see that what ends up happening is the dotted line is landfall for both. You see a massive impact on year-over-year change in weekly inflows, but it recovers very quickly. There's only about 2 weeks of impact, and for most of them, there was a sharp rebound for Irma. The Harvey rebound wasn't as sharp, but in both, it was a pretty short-lived impact on their cash inflows for small businesses. But if you look at what's happening in COVID, it's a different story. So this is also from the JP Morgan Chase Institute. This is also the 52-week change year over year. This is revenue and expense, so inflows and outflows. But you can see here that we've got significant long-term impact that has lasted through April. There's evidence to suggest that we might have seen some recovery since then, but it seems very unlikely that we have seen recovery to the fact that it'll bring us back to that 0% line. Now, when we talk about business community at large, I do want to talk about one specific example that really helps make the case on what happens to small businesses in the case of a disaster. So I want to use one small business in particular. This is Panorama Pasta and Pizza. The woman in the peach in the front of the line is Tamara Bowdish. She is my brother's wife, my sister-in-law. Behind her is her sister, and behind them is their mother. So they run a pizza restaurant, and they run it in Panama City, Florida, where I grew up. For those of you that may not know, Panama City was struck very hard by Hurricane Michael almost 2 years ago now, 2 years this fall. And I want to use the experience they had in Michael to showcase the two types of impacts that happen to businesses in a disaster. And we'll use that to extrapolate what we can do to help with resilience, both in a general disaster sense and what's happening now with the COVID response. So the two different types of impacts that could happen to a business. One, we have physical damage to structures. So this is, wildfire, flood, hurricane, wind, all those things, just blow stuff around, knock them out. Business assets, generally the same thing. Inventory damage, again, largely the same thing. And equipment damage. These are things that can largely be insured for. These are things that are, when you look at resilience packages and how small businesses get ready for a disaster, a lot of ways to ameliorate these impacts are in there. Again, insurance is obviously an important piece of that kit, but there's also things you can do to, keep certain things on the cloud if you can, to ensure that, if you have things raised up, if you think they'll flood, boarding windows, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These are things that I think a lot of people think about as the immediate impact of a disaster. And this is, of course, their truck that blew over that they had to replace. The other thing that happens to small businesses is one that I think a lot of people on this call understand, but maybe not a lot of people in general understand. And that is the more longer-term business community impacts of what happens after disaster. The first of these, and I think for most business owners, they might see as the number one problem, is the loss of customer base and sales. The second is the loss of key suppliers. Third, loss of employees. Fourth, lifeline and utility disruption. And then fifth is length of closure. So if we think back, I'll flip back for a moment. If we think back to these issues about disaster, these have almost no real measurable impact in the disaster we're facing now with COVID-19. However, COVID-19 is having a massive impact in all of these areas, primarily because people are getting ill, people can't leave, people aren't able to go to work, to supply, to fix power lines. And so all of these things are having a much greater impact on this. And I want to share one of Tamara and my brother's issues they had with this freezer. So this freezer had had finally shown up at their restaurant. So Hurricane Michael hit in early October of 2018, and so they were closed for weeks and weeks. One of the things that got destroyed in the flood was their freezer, and so they reached out. They could not get a freezer locally. There was nowhere within 100 miles that had a industrial restaurant grade freezer they could get. They found one in Jacksonville. And so the Jacksonville freezer comes down I-10, arrives in Panama City. This is the week after Thanksgiving. Arrives in Panama City, gets unpacked. Unfortunately, it was a refrigerator. Couldn't do what they needed it to do. So when they finally found a freezer, they had to ship it from Baltimore. They didn't have a freezer on premises until a week before Christmas. And at a pizza place, you mostly can't do a lot of serving if you can't freeze anything. So they were limited in what they could do. They were limited in what they could sell until a freezer showed up. And obviously now these types of supply chain issues are no longer local. You know, they're now based on, is the plant have people that can come in who can make the freezer and package it? Are the logistics companies and the shippers, do they have enough people to drive the truck, to deliver? And these are happening nationwide. So even if you as a business are well ready, replacing things that are critical to managing your business are harder now and after disasters in general. So I want to talk about small businesses generally for a moment, particularly the small business community. So here, I have a question about if they're broken down by industry type. I'll get to that near the end. Thank you. So here we have the number of small businesses in the US. I've updated these numbers. The 2018 numbers came out a week ago, and I'll get to them near the end of the presentation, so I don't want to spoil that for anybody. So what you see here is the number of small businesses from 1988 to 2017, and that red line there is the top. For all of these charts, you're going to see a blue, and the blue are in companies that have 1 to 4 employees. Orange is 5 to 9, gray is 10 to 19. So blue is a really, really small micro, and then orange and gray are the other small companies. This is the number of firms. So all these people have EINs. All these people are counted in the business register. There are other counts for companies in the US that approach 30 million. I'm not as interested in the 23 million people that are 23 million companies that are in that count and not in this count, because those are people, that's everyone who files self-employment taxes. That's everyone who doesn't have an EIN but runs a business. They're harder to track, and almost none of them employ anybody. And so this is more about how do we get employers back up and running, which is why I stick with a smaller number. Often when you hear other folks at the chamber talk about this, they usually use the larger number because that's more about the business community at large. But the thing I want to point out here is that the number of small businesses peaked in 2007. They never recovered from the 08 recession. Based on current numbers from 2018, it could be possible they've rebounded, but we'll get to that near the end. So, but I want the people to keep that in mind, that the strength of small businesses has decreased over the past decade. It's also true for employment. But you see again, blue is 1 to 4, orange is 5 to 9, and gray is 10 to 19. You see that they employ fewer people than they employed before the recession. And so when we think about recovery and response and resiliency for small businesses, these aren't necessarily episodic or situational. There's a long-term structural problem where small businesses are unable to compete, unable to stay open, and there's a myriad of reasons for that. many of which a lot of my colleagues at Main Chamber deal with every day. But a lot of it has to do with labor availability. A lot of it has to deal with technical ability of that labor. A lot of it has to deal with, companies being bought up, merging, becoming not small, which is obviously great. But the fact that long-term trends are now pointing down in small business growth means we have broader structural issues to keep in mind as we do this. So when we think about that company growth rate, what I've done is I've added it into a different line chart here instead of that bar chart, and I've added larger companies up to 250 with that. Again, that linear line of growth is negative. I've grayed out the '08 recession. You see most companies get smaller. You see particularly massive decreases in the number of companies that are in the 50 plus range, those two lowest numbers, the brown and the light blue. And I put this up here again to give a sense of what happens to company, how many companies open and close, and this is the net, this is the net closure, or opening of these companies any given year. And the fact that it varies pretty widely year in, year out. So what I looked at last year for this conference is I looked at 3 different disasters. I looked at the Joplin tornado, I looked at Katrina, and I looked at Sandy. And I took all of the counties that were declared disasters in those places, and I treated them as a single location. So I've taken, I think it was 17 counties across all of them, created a single region for that, and then saw what happened to their company count. And that's here. So I sorted them where all the disasters happened in the same year. And that year is year 0. That's the axis in the middle. And you can see massive declines for almost every size company in the year and a half after the disaster hits, except for very small companies. And the reason for that is that a lot of mid-sized companies became small companies. So very small companies, 1 to 4, experience some growth that way. You also see a lot of folks who are laid off, who can't find work, whose businesses are destroyed, from the disasters, who start their own very small 1, 2, 3 person firms. The growth of that also has an impact on how small businesses grow. And that's something I want people to keep in mind for the end of this, that in a disaster, that actually encourages very small business growth. So when we look at those charts and we put them together, I wanted to show everyone the difference in impacts in the '08 recession and when the disaster hit. So again, when you look at the recession impact and disaster impact numbers are for these 17 intervention counties. So across them, when the recession hit, 3.7% of businesses closed, or the community got 3.7% smaller. So there were that many more closures and openings, and I'll get to the exact numbers here in a moment. In a disaster, it's strikingly similar, that the impact that a disaster has on a disaster declared county is shockingly the same as the recession did in these places. But it's not the same across sizes. As you saw here, small businesses are slightly more recession resistant than large companies overall, but they're very more disaster resistant to those rates. And for the rest, you can see pretty significant impacts across both. We see a generally 7 to 8% impact in the other small businesses after disaster. We get to these larger mid-size, the 1 to 250s, we start to see some improvement. And we see the same across the recession impact. We see 5.4 and 6 for these. The 10 to 19s seem to do a little better for some reason across the recession. But disasters tend to have a larger impact for everyone except for the 1 to 4 size companies. But what I don't want people to take away from this is that it's only about whether the amount of companies that open or close. I want to talk about not only the companies that open or close and the people they employ. Because a company can't do anything if it doesn't have people to employ who can do the work that needs to be done to provide their product or service. And this is where the difference between recession and disaster is clear. So in a recession, the labor force goes down by about 4.5%. Now, it doesn't go down necessarily in these areas. Some of it goes down because if these areas were hit particularly bad by the recession, they would have left for greener pastures. Again, I'm looking at New Orleans, looking at Joplin, Missouri, and looking at New York City. So some of it might be location based. But for those disasters, almost 10% of the labor force left in the 18 months after the disaster. For some, for New York City, rebounded quickly. They barely lost anybody and they came back pretty fast. It took Joplin almost a decade to have the same amount of people before and after the tornado. New Orleans still has not recovered its population from Katrina. And so one of the things to think about is it's not only the impact on the structures. Again, the first wave of things that we showed when companies were impacted, damage to business assets and damage to buildings and damage to inventory. It's about that other set of stuff. And while, of course, if they can't employ anybody, that's obviously a problem for them. But if their suppliers can't employ anybody, if their customers don't have jobs, if they have fewer customers, all of these things become major issues that we need to deal with. And these are things that are being exacerbated by coronavirus. So we talked a little bit about business communities. I would like to talk some about individual business birth and death rates. So you often hear the old adage that 10% of businesses close every year. That's generally true. It's a little high, but it's generally true. And so what you see here is this is from the Business Dynamics. This is from all the way back to 1980 to 2014. There's a change in the methodology in 2015 that makes it a little difficult to compare the 2 years, to compare post 2015 and pre 2015. But that's a project for another day when I have more time. So one of the things to think about is these are the number of businesses that close just generally on any given year. And so it's one of the things that a lot of people that do disaster recovery issues, particularly with businesses, have to worry about. If a business is impacted by disaster and they're on the precipice of closing, how close were they on the precipice of closing before the disaster occurred? And a lot of times when we work with companies that want to help small companies, particularly after disaster, that's a very difficult question. For most large companies and other foundations who want to help out, that question is largely avoided. They aren't particularly interested in looking at tax returns and sales and revenue and assets and all those things, these small companies, to determine if they should get a grant. But it's something that I think is part of not big P policy, federal, state, but as we think about how to help companies recover a small P policy, we have to think about a lot of companies close every year. So again, the blue line is the 1 to 4 companies where the average is closer to 12 to 13% close every year. Now, there's a difference when if you do go and look at the Business Dynamics statistics data. One thing I will caution against you is that exits and deaths are different. So a 1 to 4 might exit, but that might mean they go to the 5 to 9 group. So that's obviously great. So you have to be careful when you look at these rates. But the exit rate is going to look a lot higher than death rate, but the exit rate is not the death rate. So just something to keep in mind. And these are people, to the question of the M&As. The M&As are reflected in the exits. So they are not reflected in the deaths. So the only companies that are reflected here are companies that cease to exist at the end of the year, any given year. So that's the question about the M&As. So, and then obviously the bigger you are, the much less likely you are to close, even if you go to the 5 and 9 group. The 5 and 9 group average is maybe 3% or a little less close every year. The 10 to 19, a little less than 2. So you definitely see some impacts there. And I want everyone to sort of keep that in mind that some companies close every year and then some MSAs that might be kind of high. So let's look at the MSAs. Since 1977, across 357 MSAs, on average, 10.4% of companies close every year. Now, this number is a little higher than the number you saw before because this doesn't include all companies. Not every company is in an MSA. There's some evidence to suggest the companies in MSAs have both higher death and birth rates It's a lot easier to start companies in a place that has more than 30,000 people in it. But there's not a whole lot of variation over 40 years on rates, on business death rates across these MSAs. So Bend, Oregon, for reasons that I could not determine, had one of the highest 40-year average of business deaths per year at 13.6%. Sheboygan, Wisconsin had the lowest at 7.74. So these MSAs are clustered very tight around the average closure rates of these companies, or these MSAs, excuse me. Everyone's in a tight group. So one of the things I want to do is take a look at, well, what is the impact that a disaster had? Find the year the disaster hits an MSA, and then determine how does it have an impact on business closures in that place. I started with Katrina in 2005. Again, one of the most expensive natural disasters to hit the U.S. And as you might expect, at 21.6% of all businesses closing, New Orleans and Gulfport were tied for the top. They were the MSAs with the most business closures in 2005. Number 3 was Pascagoula, Mississippi, right next door at 14%. So this is what I expected to see. I was a little surprised at how low these numbers were, that it was only 21.6%. But again, when we look at that community data that I had shared last year and just a few minutes ago, these shouldn't be terribly surprising. It means that we had 21.6% of businesses close, and since New Orleans was around a 7% reduction rate in the number of businesses total, a roughly 14% of new businesses were started. And that's something that, again, I want people to keep in mind, that it's not just a lot of businesses are going to close, but a lot of businesses are going to open as well. And we'll get to how we can do something with them near the end. Now I wanted to look at Sandy, 2012, again, massive impact. New York, number of businesses that closed in New York. Now, again, I'm using MSAs here. This data is tracked by MSA, not by county. So I couldn't look at sort of, say, Richmond or Ocean County, any of the New York or New Jersey counties specifically. So these numbers are going to be covered pretty significantly by the rest of the MSA. Just I'm putting that out there as a comment before I think someone might flag me on it, just FYI. So for this, the New York impact is 10. So 10% of businesses in the New York MSA closed. I thought, okay, well, 2012 closure rates were generally low. A lot of companies were rocking and rolling in the sort of early stages of recession recovery. But number 1 was Provo, Utah. 11.9% of their businesses closed that year. New York was only 47th. So as destructive as Sandy was, and again, it hit a massive MSA. It only had 5 counties out of probably close to 30 or 40 declared disaster areas, but still was only good enough to bring New York to the 47th highest business closure rates in 2012. I went to 1992, Andrew. I lived in Florida, from Florida, the northern part, again, Panama City. But I remember Andrew hitting when I was a baby. I was very young when Andrew hit. I certainly don't remember it very well because I was old. But I thought, Andrew, when I looked it up, and 80,000 businesses closed in Florida. This was a report that came out about a week or two after Andrew hit. Miami did experience its largest single year impact on jobs lost. So in that business dynamics data, you can also see how many jobs are those dying businesses responsible for. And that number was the highest Miami had ever experienced, which was 9.7%. So 9.7% of Miami jobs disappeared in a week in 1992, closing 13.2% of Miami's businesses. That's only good enough for 15th. Carson City, Nevada was first at 14.4. But something that I was surprised by and probably shouldn't have was that Cape Coral Fort Myers was second at 14.3. Andrew had a bigger impact on the businesses when it went into the Gulf, hours and hours after it hit Miami. had bigger impact on the business community in that place than in Miami. So one of the things that I think we also need to think about, I'm gonna put a seed in your head for later, was whether or not what makes Miami different than Cape Coral in 1992. And something that I think we need to look at when we think about what we can do between these two. Sorry, someone has asked, I have two questions, sorry, I'll answer both of them. Endra asked, does the data include breakdown by gender and race/ethnicity as well as industry? So business dynamic statistics do not. Unfortunately, that is a straight up number of companies. It has it by establishment size, and it only has it by establishment size. One of the things I'm working on in the future, the only good measure of race and gender ownership of business is the annual survey of entrepreneurs, which is replaced this year by the annual business owner survey, which just came out a few weeks ago. So that's something that I'm looking into incorporating in this in the future. It's certainly not available for the 40-year span I'm looking at. Thank you. And then the timeline for the NOLA 21.6 closures, that calendar year. So Angie asked about how quickly it takes us 21% of business to close. So Katrina hit in September, the reports of December, 3 months. So that's how long that took. Now, taking out any companies that close naturally before September, all of the hurricane impacted ones would have happened that calendar year. And then Carolyn suggested, my Andrew question, Carolyn suggested because more money is deployed to help Miami-Dade instead of Cape Coral. That is certainly one of the reasons for sure. Where who gets more attention obviously is going to be better off. I think part of it also might have to do with Miami was just in a better off place in 1992 than Cape Coral, Fort Myers. For those of us that are from Florida or were in Florida in the 90s, Southwest Florida was sleepy. It was even more of a retirement community. Florida Gulf Coast, I don't even think existed by 1992. It certainly didn't exist in the form it has now in Fort Myers. And so places that have just a bigger engine are more able to turn that engine on and get it going to recover after a disaster than the smaller ones. But that's a great point. Now look at 2004, Ivan. We are bouncing around places I used to live. So Hurricane Ivan hit in 04. And just to give you a sense, Ivan sometimes gets lost in the shuffle between Andrew and Sandy and all those folks. And so I want to bring it up here because Ivan ranks in the top 5 of biggest economic impact disasters. And again, I think it's likely forgotten to people that aren't on this call. So apologies, I'm sure most people here remember it. But to give you a sense, Ivan shut down passenger rail from New Orleans to Jacksonville for 12 years. They didn't get the passenger rail corrected that borders I-10 until 2016. Like that's how massive Ivan was. But when I looked at the metro areas around Ivan, Panama City ranked 10th for business losses, business deaths in that year. Pensacola was 34th. Mobile, 162nd. Gulfport, 125. New Orleans, 205. It just didn't seem to have the same impact. But again, when you look at this place, again in 2004, Panama City, Panama City and I would argue Gulfport, the weakest economies of these, they just don't recover as quickly as a Pensacola, Mobile, or New Orleans. Keep in mind this is the year before Katrina, so everything about New Orleans there is about the same. Stephen has asked, Puerto Rico, excuse me, reported increases in GDP post-disaster. Is it possible to split the aid influx apart from the damage to the pre-existing economy? It would be possible. Yeah, I think it certainly would be possible. You could do the economic impact of aid pretty easily since you know where that aid's going. And I think one of the projects, someone with a little more economics background than I could do, is do an impact survey of what that money did. Because then once you do the impact survey, you can extrapolate backwards and see what happened if you hadn't done anything. And certainly things that, the mechanisms to do so in 92 for Andrew, certainly not what they were for Sandy. I think we learned a lot after Katrina. And so I think there might be difference than what happened pre or post. So what does this mean generally when we think about COVID? Well, my thought, and again, I'm saying this as Lawrence Bowdish, who has a PhD in climametrics and economic history, not Lawrence Bowdish, the economist for the Chamber of Commerce or the Chamber of Commerce Foundation. But I think one thing we can think about is that by the time a recovery from COVID occurs, we could expect an impact on the national business rates on average, the same as New Orleans after Katrina. I think that's probably what we can expect, and that's going to be nationwide. But the real difference maker, I think, between what happened in New Orleans after 2005 and what could happen in the US has partially to do in where businesses are more resilient, more ready, where businesses can reopen safely, where economies in general are prodded along, is the labor force participation rate in the population. Because remember when I showed that last impact on businesses between business closures and population growth and decline, that those disasters create these massive changes in labor force. And that's a long time trend. And this is something I want to get everyone on the same page on. Labor force participation rate, which counts everyone from 15 to 64. Doesn't matter, like if you are counted by somebody and you have a pulse, you're counted as part of this group, and you're between ages of 15 and 64. In 2000, labor force participation was at a nearly all-time high at around 67.5%. So 67.5% of everybody from 15 to 64 had a job. Now that counts people who don't want a job, students, kids in high school, early retirees, people who stay at home for whatever reason they may like. That number's been going down for the past 20 years. And a lot of folks can't figure out why. It's been going down regardless of recessions, which have triggered them to go down more quickly, but they've gone down regardless of recessions, regardless of economic growth. Just fewer people are working. Around a third of it, based on economic forecasts, about a third of it have to do with the increasing average age in this group of 15 to 64-year-olds. It's picking up more people who are retiring a bit early, but that doesn't explain all of it. It only explains about a third of it. So more people are opting not to be in the civilian labor force. And when you look at the past few months, it's plummeted. So starting from January 2020, we were at 63.4. It just dropped through the roof to near to 60. Rates we haven't seen honestly since before women started going to work en masse in the World War II post-war era. And so this is going to be a large issue in how we help companies get back. Because not only does this impact whether or not companies can employ people to do the work they need them to do, it also impacts whether or not these people have income to engage in commerce. Because people that are in that labor force participation rate, what I don't want people to think about is that we have people who are participating in the labor force. We have people who don't want to be in the labor force for whatever reason, students, work at stay at home, etc. And the unemployed, the technically unemployed. Because the technically unemployed significantly undercounts the number of people that are actually looking for work. And so, because you come off, based on what state you're in, you come off official unemployment rolls when your unemployment benefits run out, which is why unemployment's a really sticky measure. It takes a while for unemployment to grow because they're always kicking people off of it. It's obviously, the COVID-19 has thrown that out the window, but something we're going to see when the unemployment benefits start going down, if they aren't extended for whatever purpose or whatever reason in any state, there's a number that the BLS tracks that's called discouraged workers. So these are people who are not unemployed, who do not have a job, but would take a job if offered one. They are looking for work, off the rolls, and want a job. And those numbers are pretty significant. And I have them here. BLS actually does track this by race, ethnicity, and gender, and just point out some of these discourage rates. And this chart, excuse me, I should have brought this out. This chart is from the end of 2019. So these numbers haven't been updated yet for what we're experiencing right now. So these numbers are from when the economy was rocking and rolling in 2019, and unemployment rates were low or historic low. I'm sorry, Andrew. Yes, I'll move that. Apologies. That's just the Hispanic column. Excuse me. So what you see here is that for a lot of these groups, particularly African Americans and Hispanics, Latinos, excuse me, what you see is that the discouraged rates are 2-3 times the unemployment rate. So there's a lot of people out there looking for work, and that's more of a matchmaking question in 2018, 2019, when companies were growing and they couldn't find people to fill jobs. Now these numbers are going to be less of an academic problem and more of an additional number of people who are looking for work, who can't get it, who aren't counted as the unemployed. So we've got this huge labor issue we need to think about. So, however, regardless of the J, U, or V-shaped recovery, we should expect to see a massive explosion in small business. Part of that has to do for the reasons that I brought up before, when we saw those upticks in small business counts after the disaster. A lot of mid-sized companies become small companies. A lot of people are laid off and start their own companies. Business birth rates are pretty high. But there's something else, another trend growing that's going to encourage the growth of small businesses anyway. The reason I didn't use the 2018 numbers that came out about a week ago on the number of business growths in that general community, so not the individual birth and deaths, but the number of businesses per county. The reason I didn't use those in this chart is because I didn't believe them. One of the things that I've been talking to people in these presentations about is that when the rise of the consultant and gig economy really heat up, and that happened in 2017, 2018, those numbers are going to show pretty significant increase in number of small businesses, because some of those people, not all of them, but many of them are going to incorporate, they're going to form an LLC, they're going to protect themselves in such a way where they actually become their own companies. It'll make it easier for them to operate in the gig economy that way. Well, the number of small companies that started in 2018, the general increase is, as you saw in those charts, 1-2%. There were 10% more 1 to 4 person companies in 2018 and 2017. And so what's happening is that we're seeing a growth of small companies. Some of them, frankly, are small companies that are people who would have just been self-employed 2 years ago, 3 years ago. People who are never going to employ somebody, who certainly are companies, certainly are businesses, certainly are as deserving of help after any type of disaster or recession. But if you're trying to help companies because you want to make an impact in a community, because you want to look at the impact of a community, you're likely not going to make that impact if you focus blindly on small companies, because now small companies in a lot of these places are turning into single person institutions that will never employ anybody, no matter how much growth they have. So until we get a little more detail on those numbers, these numbers are, what's the right word for them? Preliminary. That's the P word I'm looking for. Well, the numbers are preliminary, and I'm sure we'll learn more in the coming months as the details come out and we see more per MSA and things like that. The jury's out on that, but suffice to say, we're going to see a lot more small companies be created, both economically and for this reason. So one of the things that I think we need to look at, is what does all this mean? So we need to keep developing these small business tools that are both recovery and resiliency oriented. We need to make sure that companies, either for moments or for periods, be they after a tornado, hurricane, wildfire, earthquake, or in this long-term recession, COVID-19 response, that those companies are ready. And I think a lot of people might be thinking it's too late. One, I don't think it's too late for the small companies that are trying to hang on. And I think there's a comment in here about how companies are trying to stay open in an attempt to, really gain some of this. But more small businesses are going to be created. And I think if you can catch them closer to the point of creation, they might be able to take on some of these resiliency and recovery tools more completely. Again, working with many local chambers as we have, both Brooks and myself, working with them to build community ecosystems is very important. I'm always, even though I've seen it happen for years now, I'm always really impressed with how quickly, how completely, how efficiently local chambers are able to disperse material, get small businesses on the phone, work out recovery plans, and it's really effective. And the other two are things that, I talked a little bit about and Ender asked about gig industry and independent contractors that I brought up just a minute ago. The other two things are kind of related. We need to ensure that quality employment is available for everyone who wants it anywhere it's needed. That labor force participation rate has been in decline for years. And I don't know what recovery would look like. I don't know if the recession is going to drive more people back into the labor force, people who thought they could retire or people who were single income households and now can't be. Is that going to drive more people into participating in the long term? Is it going to, and where is it going to do that? Are there going to be some places where it's going to be easier to do than others? But I don't think this will reverse the long-term trend and fewer people working. And so we need to make sure that for people that are working and people looking for work, that quality employment's available, that they are ready to do the jobs that are required of them by their markets. And that's something that other folks in the chamber and other parts of the foundation, particularly Center for Ed and Workforce, work on the training and things like that for folks to better match available labor with available jobs. And I think the last thing I'll talk about here that I think a lot of folks are kind of sleeping on, particularly as it has to do with disaster response and recovery, is the impacts of remote labor. Everyone who can work from home right now is. So how long is that going to last? What impact is it going to have on companies and places that rely their business on people being in their office? Be it, restaurants and office parks or, any sort of places that have chosen where they are because that's where a lot of people work. What's that going to do to those other companies in the long term? In addition, are people going to want to work from home indefinitely? A lot of companies are already pushing past the Labor Day date. They're going to 2021. And there's some places that you don't need to ever come back to the office. Well, does that mean, are those people going to continue to live in the places where their employer is? What's that going to do to the labor force? Is that going, if everyone expands in different places, what's it going to do to certain MSAs? There's already some issues with counting MSAs if people do a lot of commuting. 27% of people work in a county they don't live in. And tracking that's kind of difficult, right? Because when you think of unemployment rates per, when you look at a small area, counties, MSAs, well, a lot of people don't work in that county. So how do they count or not? And I think if that number is going to get harder and harder to track. And so I think when you look at places that get hit by a natural disaster, what the number of people who either work remotely from there and have their headquarters elsewhere, or people who remotely work to there could really impact some of the decisions you might make in helping them out. So I think that's all I have. I know a bunch have come in here. So wow, geez Louise, y'all. Okay. James also said in the hub, the tax preferences for qualified companies that began in 1718. Absolutely correct. Yeah. Based on those, definitely, and there's a lot of encouragement for more incorporations at the end of that time. So that has also created a lot more small companies. Does the duration, amount, and end date for unemployment benefits affect how many able-bodied people try and successfully return to the workforce? This is from Jed. So that's an interesting question. I think up until the unemployment benefits we're experiencing right now, or the people that are experiencing them right now, unemployment was based on some sort of could be based on some sort of ratio of your pay before, because you're pulling from unemployment insurance. That's not the case now. Now there are certain floors and certain ceilings. I don't think we're going to have a good answer for that until we sort of come out of this, but I think that's going to be an important answer. The incentivization of higher unemployment based on comparatively based on what people experienced before. So, but I don't know of any other. If people do, please put it in Hub. Given the modern gig economy, why are single employee businesses grouped with 1 to 4? Isn't 2 to 4 employee business more important to analyze? Oh, I'm sorry, David. I should have made that more clear. In this categorization, if it's 1 to 4 employees and you own it, you're not the 1, you're the 0. So this is someone who employs someone else. So apologies for that. Let's see here. I should have made that more clear. I'll make it more clear in the slides. I'll make these slides available in Hub in a little bit. Yeah, I blocked the header. Got that. Any idea on how state governments can re-examine existing rules and regs to help viable businesses be more sustainable? That is a question that my colleagues over at the main chamber would take on the state level. If you mean sustainable as in generally resilient and not economically sustainable, I think we're seeing I think we're going to see a lot of experiments on that happening right now. I don't know of any states that are really economic development agencies or commerce departments of states that are taking a really specific look at sort of business creations right now, but it'd be interesting to look in what they see. Stephen, it's important to have support services to help startups, workforce, and business transitions. Yes, it is incredibly important. And I think there's a lot of options for small businesses in that ecosystem. And I think there's been an explosion of them of late. I think what I think is missing for businesses is not a business that is 1 to 4. I think it's the 5 to 20 folks, because a lot of times they're the folks that might need greater help on just generally financing and things of that nature. And I think that's missing. Now, it certainly occurs in chambers for sure, but I think it's the small to mid-sized companies that could certainly use more of that. Jed asks, do you see multiple events like COVID and business loss from riots substantially impact businesses' ability to return? So I think the answer to that is yes. It's certainly going to impact business can return, because this isn't like a disaster in the fact that, like, in most cases, Katrina accepted, when the water recedes and you fix everything, it's fixed, right? COVID and the social justice issues that are happening right now are introducing a number of issues that might not be that related. Even in COVID by itself, we have people who are there is going to be a challenge with getting people participating fully in commerce the way we would have recognized it 6 months ago, until we can beat this thing with either amazing treatment or immunizations or you name it. Until that happens, it's not going to look like January 2020 or December 2019. And then there's a lot of companies who are based on that model, on commerce looking like what it did before. And until commerce looks like what it did before, those companies can't come back. And if you look at the business losses from what's happening with the social unrest, my parents lived in DC during the riots in the 60s. And I'm a historian, so I'll talk about the 60s for a second. So that was a real push to the suburbs. because for the most part, those riots, social unrest, the civil rights movements in the 60s that really disrupted commerce, and obviously they did a lot of good, but one of the consequences, to get heard, they disrupted commerce, was everyone going to the suburbs, and everyone were people and organizations. And so what the question about what's going to happen now is, will COVID and, excuse me, not COVID, we're talking about the riots, excuse me, will the social justice efforts, the disruptions that they are causing to be heard, will those disruptions either last long enough, be impactful enough, or be localized enough for companies to respond? And if so, where would they go? I don't think there's a lot of larger companies, particularly, who are going to move because of this. For smaller companies, I don't know if this is an honest, I don't know. I'm not saying I don't know, just to say it. I don't know if the impact on these social justice movements are going to be strong enough and localized enough for a business not to reopen because of it. So that would be my thought about that. Again, that's a personal thought, just, not a chamber position, obviously, but I think that it's a broader effort than what we've seen in other places and other times in American history. So with that, we're at time. I talked for an hour. Okay. I used to be a college professor, if that wasn't clear. But I thank everyone for your time here. We'll be going into another keynote quite soon. I'll have this deck available for download later today if you'd like to get to it on Hub. Thanks everyone for your time. Really appreciate it. And we'll talk soon. Thank you.